Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. The shadow at prom night. The night of our high school graduation was supposed to be unforgettable. It was the night we had all been waiting for, the culmination of 4 years of hard work, late-night study sessions, and making memories that would last a lifetime. But for me, it became something far darker. I remember the feeling of excitement in the air as I walked into the grand ballroom, my suit shimmering under the dim lights. The place was decorated in shades of silver and gold, with balloons and streamers floating above us. Everyone looked stunning. The music thudded in the background, a mixture of modern pop hits and slow dances, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up, and though I couldn't put my finger on it, I felt a growing unease. The first few hours went by like a blur. We laughed, took photos, and talked about our future plans. Everyone seemed to be having the time of their lives. But as the night wore on, I couldn't help but notice a strange, almost imperceptible chill in the air. It wasn't the temperature, it was something else entirely, something unnatural. I was sitting with my friends at a table near the back of the room when it happened. The music slowed down, and the crowd started to thin out as people headed to the dance floor. That's when I first noticed the shadow on the wall. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. The way the chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting their soft glow, made it easy to mistake the shadows for something else. But then, the shape began to move. It was subtle at first, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't just a shadow of something solid, it was alive. I turned to my friends, hoping they'd see it too. But when I pointed at the wall, they just looked at me like I was crazy. "What's wrong?" one of them asked, laughing nervously. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't know how to explain it. How could I describe the way the shadow seemed to stretch and grow on its own? How it swayed as if it had a mind of its own? It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. And yet, it felt like it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. As the night went on, I couldn't take my eyes off that shadow. It started to take shape, faint outlines of a figure, tall and looming. It had no face, no distinct features, just a silhouette that seemed to be watching the crowd. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I wasn't the only one who started to feel it. My friends began to notice the eerie presence too. Some of them tried to laugh it off, but others were visibly uncomfortable. They moved away from the wall, shifting their chairs, avoiding looking directly at it. But no matter where we moved, the shadow seemed to follow. It crept closer to us as if it was drawn to our fear. It wasn't just on the wall anymore, it was starting to stretch across the floor, inching its way toward the middle of the room. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just people talking in the crowd. But then I realized there was something different about the voices. They weren't human. They sounded hollow, distant, as if coming from far, far away. And yet, they were so close, echoing in the back of my mind. "Leave, now." The words were faint, but I heard them clearly. They seemed to come from the shadow itself, as if it was speaking directly into my thoughts. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just overreacting. But deep down, I knew something terrible was happening. The room grew darker, the music faded, and the chatter of the other students seemed to die away. All I could hear was the whispering, the sound of my own heartbeat, and the chilling presence of the shadow drawing closer. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a force, something ancient and malevolent, that was slowly consuming the room. I glanced around the ballroom, looking for someone who could explain what was happening. But everyone seemed to be in a trance, frozen in place, as if they didn't notice the growing darkness around them. Only a few of us were aware of what was truly happening. The shadow was no longer a mere figure on the wall. It was alive, moving, and it wanted something. Something from us. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach, my thoughts racing. My eyes locked onto the shadow again. It was no longer just a creeping form on the wall. It was shifting, moving with purpose, and as it extended across the floor, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The shadows were spreading like ink spilling across paper. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. And then the air grew heavy, as though a storm was brewing inside the ballroom. But there were no clouds, no rain. Just an oppressive, suffocating weight pressing down on us. I could feel the terror rising in the pit of my stomach, and I knew deep down that if we didn't leave, if we didn't run, we might never get out of here. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear the whispers. Some of them were still dancing, laughing, completely unaware of the growing danger. I tried shouting, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming silence that had replaced the music. It was as if the entire world had been paused, frozen in place, except for me and the shadow. Come on, we need to leave. Now! I yelled at the others, but they just gave me confused looks, as though they were trapped in some kind of trance. I grabbed my best friend, Kyle, by the arm, shaking him. Kyle, don't you see it? The shadow, it's coming for us. Kyle blinked, a blank expression on his face. What are you talking about? There's nothing there, man. Relax. His words made no sense. I had never seen him so out of it before. He was always the one who'd joke around and lighten the mood. But now, he was distant, like a shell of the person I knew. Suddenly, the shadow seemed to pulse, growing larger, more intense, and with it, the whispers turned to a voice. One that felt like it was coming from the deepest, darkest pit of the earth. Leave. This place is mine. My heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real, echoing through the air. I looked around desperately, but no one seemed to notice. It was as if I was the only one who could hear it. I glanced at the wall again, where the figure had started to take form. It was taller now, a looming silhouette with an outline of something that resembled a face, but it wasn't human. The eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were hollow, black pits. There was no emotion in them, no life. Just emptiness. A shiver ran down my spine. I pulled Kyle toward the door, not caring that he was resisting. I could feel something cold seeping into my bones. The shadow was moving closer, stretching its long, black tendrils across the floor toward us, as if it could reach out and grab us at any moment. Guys, seriously, I shouted to the rest of the room. We need to get out of here. Now. But no one moved. The entire ballroom seemed frozen, caught in some eerie stillness. The music had completely stopped. There were no sounds, except for that deep, unnatural hum coming from the shadow itself. I glanced back at the door, but it was too far to reach. The shadow had already moved across the room, stretching between us and the exit. I turned back to my friends, my fear growing with every passing second. "What is it? What's happening?" I demanded, but Kyle still couldn't hear me. His eyes were glazed over, his face pale, as though he were in a daze. The figure in the shadow began to shift. The shape of it seemed to grow clearer now. Long, thin arms reached out, grasping the air like it was feeling for something or someone. It was coming for us. I turned to Kyle again, shaking him harder. "Kyle, please. Snap out of it. We have to go." His lips parted as though he was about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, his eyes seemed to widen with a new recognition, and for the first time that night, I saw something in his face, a flicker of fear. And then I heard it, the most chilling sound I've ever heard in my life. A low, guttural growl, coming from deep within the shadow. It echoed across the room, a terrifying sound that made my blood run cold. The shadows rippled and recoiled as if the very room itself was alive with dark energy. We had to get out. There was no time left. I grabbed Kyle's arm and dragged him toward the door, but before we could reach it, the shadow surged forward, blocking our path. I could feel its cold energy wrapping around us, squeezing the air from my lungs, making it harder to breathe. I looked to the others, hoping for a miracle, but they were still frozen. There was no one else. It was just me, Kyle, and the thing in the darkness. The shadow began to creep in on us, closing in tighter, like a trap being sprung. "You're not leaving, ever," the voice whispered again, now louder, more commanding. It was as though the very air was pulsing with its will. I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest, not knowing where to turn or how to escape. But I could see the exit now, just a few steps away. The shadow was closing in, but I had to try. With every ounce of strength I had, I shoved Kyle toward the door, praying that whatever it was wouldn't take us before we could get out. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. But as I turned it, the shadow lunged forward, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. It felt like an eternity, like I had fallen into a deep, endless void. But when I finally opened my eyes, I was no longer in the ballroom. The familiar music, the chatter of my classmates, the warmth of the night, all of it was gone. Instead, I was lying on cold, hard concrete, gasping for air, my chest rising and falling with panic. The world around me was dark, shrouded in shadows. The air was thick and heavy, like I was suffocating. I tried to push myself up, but my body felt like lead. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened, what I had just escaped. I looked around, disoriented. The place was unfamiliar, nothing like the ballroom, nothing like the world I knew. The shadows here were darker, deeper, and they seemed to move of their own accord. There was no light, no escape. Only an endless stretch of blackness. Then, I heard the whispers again. At first, they were distant, almost inaudible, but they grew louder as though they were closing in on me. They echoed in my mind, in my bones, vibrating through every fiber of my being. The voice from the shadow, that voice, was back. "You thought you could escape." I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The voice wasn't coming from one direction, it was everywhere. It swirled around me, surrounding me, suffocating me. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" The answer came in a laugh, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It was a laugh full of malice, like it was mocking me for thinking I could get away. The voice seemed to relish in my fear. "This is where you belong," it hissed. "This is where all of you belong." The ground beneath me trembled. The shadows seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, responding to the voice's command. And then, I saw it, a figure, emerging from the darkness. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as it came closer, I could make out its shape. Tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, twisted. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a featureless void, like a mask with no eyes, no mouth, no expression. Just emptiness. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering. My body was weak, but fear gave me strength. I had to get away. I had to find a way out. But it was too late. The figure was already standing before me, towering over me. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The whispers were louder now, swirling around us, like a swarm of insects buzzing in my ears. "Leave, now," I whispered to myself, but I knew it was futile. There was no escaping this. There was no escaping it. The figure reached out, its long fingers curling toward me. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was about to come. I had no strength left to fight, no hope left to cling to. I was trapped in the shadows. But then, just as the figure's fingers brushed against my skin, something unexpected happened. The darkness around us began to crack. A thin sliver of light appeared in the distance, a small, fragile gleam that seemed to push back against the shadows. The figure recoiled, its form trembling, as if it were being pulled away by some invisible force. I opened my eyes, staring at the light. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was hope, something I thought I had lost forever. The figure hissed, retreating into the shadows, its form dissipating as though it couldn't bear the light. The whispers began to fade, replaced by the sound of rushing air, like a storm blowing through the darkness. I pushed myself up, using the last of my strength to crawl toward the light. I didn't care what it was, what it meant, I just knew that I had to get there. I had to escape this nightmare. As I got closer, the light grew brighter, and I felt a strange warmth flooding through me. The shadows seemed to recoil, pulling away from me as if they feared the light. It felt like a force, a protective barrier that was shielding me from the darkness. I reached the light, and for a moment, everything was still. I felt peace. I felt safe. But then, the voice came again, this time softer, almost a whisper in the back of my mind. "You can't escape. You can't outrun us." The light flickered, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it wasn't real. It was just another trick, another illusion. The darkness was still here. It had never left. With a gasp, I turned around, but there was no time to think. The figure had returned, emerging from the shadows once more, its form twisting and shifting as it came toward me. It was faster now, more determined. I tried to run, but my legs gave way beneath me. My body was exhausted, and fear was eating away at me. There was no escape. No way out. But then, just as the figure reached me, something else happened. The ballroom. I was back in the ballroom. The sudden change was dizzying. The music blared again, the chatter of my classmates filled the air, and the warm light of the chandeliers illuminated the room. The shadows on the wall were gone, and everyone was dancing again, laughing, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. I knew something was terribly wrong. I knew the shadow was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to strike again. The question was, when would it come? Everything seemed normal again, too normal. The music played, the lights flickered in that warm, inviting glow, and the floor was covered in a sea of dancing students. But for me, it was all an illusion, a facade meant to deceive. I could still feel the weight of the darkness, lurking just beneath the surface of this cheerful, bustling room. I stood there, frozen, my hands trembling as I scanned the room. My classmates were all laughing, oblivious to the terror I had just experienced. Kyle was dancing with some girls near the center of the room, completely carefree, as though nothing had happened. I wanted to yell at them, warn them, but the words got stuck in my throat. They wouldn't understand. No one would. I turned slowly, searching for any sign of the shadow, any trace of that eerie presence. But it was like it had never been there. The walls were bright and clean, the floor shining beneath the feet of the dancers. The shadow had disappeared. For a moment, I almost believed it was over. Maybe it had been some kind of horrible dream, some trick my mind had played on me in my panic. I tried to push the image of the shadow from my mind, to let myself enjoy the night, like everyone else. But then, I caught sight of the wall again. And there it was. The shadow was back, creeping in the corner of my vision, as though it had never left. This time, it was different. It didn't just hover on the wall. It stretched across the floor like dark tendrils, moving, living, creeping toward the middle of the room where everyone was dancing. My heart skipped a beat. No one else seemed to notice it. They were too wrapped up in their conversations, their laughter, their joy. They couldn't see the growing darkness that was slowly consuming the room. But I could. I could see it, feel it, sense it. I started to back away, slowly, making my way toward the edge of the room, my eyes never leaving the shadow. It was growing, expanding, and with each moment, the whispers returned. They grew louder now, and the voice that had haunted me echoed in my mind once more. You can't escape. You will never escape. The air was growing cold again. I could feel the temperature dropping, as though the warmth of the ballroom was being drained by some unseen force. My breath began to fog up in front of me. The whispers were now joined by the low growl, that same guttural sound that made my insides churn with dread. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I glanced back at the door. The exit was still there, but it seemed so far away, like a mirage in a desert. I started to move toward it, my legs trembling with fear, each step heavier than the last. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet were glued to the floor, reluctant to move. It felt like the shadow was reaching out, pulling me back, trying to drag me into its dark embrace. Leave now, the voice growled again, closer now, right behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. The shadow was everywhere, stretching across the walls, the floor, wrapping itself around the entire ballroom like a suffocating web. I was almost to the door when the figure appeared again. It stepped out of the darkness, towering over me, its featureless face looming in the dim light. It was no longer just a silhouette. It was real, alive, its limbs reaching out toward me like long, twisted claws. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that screamed in unison, and the air thickened with dread. The figure's presence was suffocating, overwhelming. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in its grip. And then, Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a flash of light burst across the room. The chandelier overhead flickered violently, and the shadows shrank back, retreating into the corners. The whispers quieted for a split second, and the figure seemed to recoil as if the light was burning it. The moment of silence felt like an eternity. But then, the shadow surged forward, its growl filling the air again, louder than before. It was faster now, relentless. It wasn't going to let me go. In a panic, I reached for the door handle again, my heart racing. I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't let it win. With a force that surprised me, the door swung open. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The moment I stepped outside, the oppressive weight lifted, and I could breathe again. But I knew it wasn't over. The shadow was still there, waiting. Watching. I ran down the corridor, desperate to get as far away from the ballroom as possible. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft and faint at first, but they grew louder. Closer. The figure was following me. I turned a corner, my mind racing, trying to think of where to go. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out before me like a maze. It felt like I was being herded, pushed toward a destination I couldn't escape. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the silent corridor, and I realized with growing horror that the whispers had started again. Louder. More urgent. You can't outrun us. You're ours now. I stopped, my body frozen with dread. The voice was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. The walls seemed to close in. I was being corralled, trapped in a place I couldn't escape. I turned, looking for something, anything, to help me, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the next corner, was another door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out from inside. It wasn't much, but it was all I had left. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't care where it led. I just had to get away from the shadow. I reached the door, pushing it open, and stepped inside. And then, everything stopped. The moment I stepped through that door, I felt a strange sense of relief, as though the worst was over. But as soon as the door slammed shut behind me, the peaceful silence was shattered by an intense wave of cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that simply chills your skin. It felt like the very temperature of the air had shifted, plunging the room into a frozen void. My breath clouded in front of me, and a deep shiver ran down my spine. I turned, ready to flee if the shadow was right behind me, but when I looked around, I froze in place. The room I had entered wasn't like any place I had ever seen before. It was vast, endless, almost as if the walls themselves stretched on for miles, lost in darkness. The ceiling was high above, obscured by a layer of thick, swirling mist that hung in the air. The floor beneath me was cracked, darkened, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The entire space was shrouded in shadow, and I could hear the faintest echoes of something distant, something haunting. It was like a hollow, mournful cry reverberating through the walls. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was, but there were no windows, no exits. Just endless darkness. I could hear nothing but the eerie silence that enveloped me, punctuated only by the sound of my own breathing. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice trembling. And that's when I heard it again, the low growl. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder, closer. My heart raced, and I felt the sudden urge to run, to escape whatever was coming for me. But as I turned to flee, I stumbled. The floor beneath me shifted, and I was thrown off balance. I caught myself on the edge of a crumbling stone wall, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. As I looked down, I realized that the floor wasn't solid at all. It was made of jagged, broken tiles that led into a chasm, a deep, black void that seemed to go on forever. The growl grew louder, and I could feel its presence closing in on me. There was no more time to waste. I bolted, running as fast as my legs would carry me. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, but with each step, the growl followed, growing stronger, like a predator chasing its prey. I had no idea where I was running, only that I had to get away. I had to find a way out. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the figure from the shadow, its faceless gaze locked onto me. But there was nothing. Just the dark, endless room. And then, a sudden burst of light, faint at first, like a candle flame in the distance, caught my eye. It was far off, barely visible, but I felt a strange pull toward it. The light felt different. It wasn't like the ballroom's warm glow. It was cold, distant, almost beckoning, as if calling me forward. I had no choice but to follow. With every step, the growl faded slightly, replaced by the eerie silence of the room. But the light remained, growing closer, almost within reach. As I moved toward it, I felt the air shift again, this time with a sense of anticipation, like something was waiting for me, just beyond the light. The closer I got, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something far beyond my understanding. Finally, I reached the light. As I stepped into its glow, I stopped dead in my tracks. The room was different now. The shadows had retreated, leaving only the dim light to illuminate the space. The walls were no longer cracked and ancient. Instead, they were smooth, cold marble, reflecting the light in strange ways. The floor beneath me was polished, almost too perfect. But what really stopped me was the figure standing at the center of the room. It wasn't the same as before. This time, the figure was more solid, more real. A tall, imposing figure, draped in a flowing black cloak that seemed to absorb the light around it. The cloak seemed to swirl and twist in a way that didn't quite make sense, as if it were part of the darkness itself. Its face was still a void, no eyes, no mouth, just an endless darkness that looked like it could pull you in and consume you. It was staring directly at me. I couldn't move. I was frozen, unable to look away from the figure. It felt like time itself had stopped. And then, the voice returned. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" The voice was colder now, more powerful, like the very room was speaking to me. "This is your end." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped in this place, locked in its gaze. The figure raised its hand slowly, and as it did, the shadows around me began to move again, coiling and shifting, like tendrils reaching out to consume me. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom. The growl returned, louder this time, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. "You are mine," the voice whispered, and I felt the words reverberate through my body, as if the room itself was speaking directly to my soul. I could feel the cold wrapping around me, closing in on my chest, suffocating me. The shadows pressed closer, and I knew that I was about to be swallowed whole. But then, just as the darkness closed in, the light flared up again, brighter than ever. It was blinding, searing through the room like a bolt of lightning. The shadows shrieked and recoiled, retreating from the light as if they were afraid. The figure seemed to stagger back, its form flickering as if it couldn't maintain its shape under the intensity of the light. For a moment, there was nothing but the brilliance of the light, and then everything stopped. The blinding light didn't last long. It seemed to burn the darkness away, but only for a few fleeting moments before it began to fade, as if it had exhausted its strength. My vision swam, and I found myself blinking rapidly, trying to adjust to the sudden shift in the air. The oppressive coldness still hung in the space, but now it felt more distant, like it was retreating. The figure before me flickered once more, its form unstable, as if the light was holding it at bay. The shadows around it twisted and writhed, hesitant, like they were afraid to make another move. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they would strike again. I didn't have time to think. My mind raced for any way to escape, but there was no clear path forward. The figure was still standing there, towering over me, its presence a constant, suffocating force. I was trapped in this strange, shifting place between light and shadow, neither one willing to let go. I looked around, desperate for a way out, when I noticed something. The light wasn't just a source of illumination, it was a doorway. At the edges of the glowing circle, I saw faint outlines of another world, a different dimension, something beyond this twisted reality. I didn't question it. There was no time to question it. I knew that if I stayed here, I would be consumed, lost forever in this void. I turned and ran toward the light, my heart pounding as the shadowed figure behind me let out a low, terrifying hiss. The growl returned, louder now, filled with rage. The figure's hand reached out toward me, its long, claw-like fingers stretching as if to grasp me. No! I screamed, as I pushed myself harder, faster, ignoring the burning in my legs, ignoring the way my mind screamed at me to stop. The light was close now, so close, and I could feel it pulling me toward it, giving me strength. I dove toward the edge of the light, and as my hand reached out, the world around me seemed to warp. The shadows were closing in, wrapping themselves around my body, tugging at my soul. But in that moment, the light burst into a brilliant flare of energy, and I was pulled through. For a split second, everything was nothing but pure, blinding brightness, overwhelming and suffocating. It felt like being submerged in water, my ears ringing, my body weightless, my breath stolen away. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the light faded, and I found myself gasping for air, lying flat on my back on solid ground. The cold air felt sharp against my skin, and I quickly sat up, looking around in a daze. I was back in the real world. I was in the parking lot outside the ballroom. The cool night air filled my lungs, and I could hear the distant hum of the city, the gentle rustling of trees. The place was empty, silent, save for the soft whisper of the wind. I looked around, confused, trying to understand how I had ended up here. Was it all a dream? Had it been real? The darkness, the figure, the growl, it had all felt so vivid, so real. I stood up, shakily, brushing the dirt off my clothes. The prom was still inside, the celebration still in full swing. The parking lot was eerily quiet, and yet, it felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again. I looked over my shoulder, and the shadow was there. It was hovering just at the edge of my vision, barely perceptible but undeniable. It was watching me. The growl was faint, but it was there, a constant hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. I tried to push the thought away. I had escaped. I had gotten out. but the feeling of dread never quite left. The shadow, whatever it was still with me. It had followed me. It had found me again. I had no idea how I was going to stop it, or if I even could. But one thing was clear, I was not free. I would never be free. As I turned to leave the parking lot, I felt its presence behind me, like a shadow I couldn't escape, no matter how fast I ran. The growl followed, faint but persistent, like a distant storm on the horizon, always there, always waiting. And as I walked away, the chilling truth hit me. It wasn't over. It would never be over. I walked away, the cold night air biting at my skin, but the feeling of unease was overwhelming. The further I went from the ballroom, the more it felt like the shadows were closing in. The growl, faint as it was, echoed in my mind, twisting through my thoughts like a reminder that I wasn't free, not yet. I told myself that maybe it was just in my head, that the terror I had experienced was nothing more than a figment of an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. The shadow wasn't just some illusion. It was real. And it was coming for me. As I reached my car, I hesitated for a moment. The parking lot was deserted, the quiet only broken by the distant sounds of the prom still going on inside the ballroom. I glanced around nervously, half expecting the figure to materialize out of the darkness. But nothing stirred. Everything was still. I got into my car, locking the doors behind me. I needed to get home, to escape this nightmare, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The growl was now a constant hum in the back of my mind, like a distant storm. The shadow was still there, lurking just beyond my reach, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started the car, the engine purring to life, and I pulled out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I drove down the empty streets, the headlights illuminating the darkened roads. But the further I went, the more I felt the oppressive weight of the shadow closing in. It was everywhere, hovering just beyond the edge of my vision, a dark presence that I couldn't escape. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, but the fear in my chest told me otherwise. Something wasn't right. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. That the shadow was still there, just waiting for me to slip up, to let my guard down. Suddenly, the growl pierced my thoughts, loud and clear. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, panic rising within me. The street was empty. There was no one there. But the growl, it was so close now, like it was right beside me. I grabbed the door handle, ready to jump out of the car and run, but as I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The shadow was there, standing at the edge of the street, barely visible in the dim light. It was watching me. I tried to start the car again, my hands trembling, but the engine sputtered. The shadow moved closer, its form growing more defined, and I could hear the whispering again, so close, like it was in my ear. "You can't run from me," the voice hissed, cold and mocking. "You will never escape." I threw the car into reverse, my heart racing as I tried to back away, but it was too late. The shadow surged forward, faster than I could react. The growl became deafening, filling my ears, my mind. I slammed the car into drive, speeding away as fast as I could, but the shadow seemed to move with me, keeping pace, always just behind. My breath came in ragged gasps as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadow was there, right on my tail, its dark tendrils stretching across the road, growing longer, reaching for me. It was closing in. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. The fear in my chest tightened like a vice. The streets were empty. There was no one else around. Just me and the shadow. The growl became a roar, deafening, filling the car, rattling my bones. I glanced ahead, and the world around me seemed to distort, as if the road was bending and twisting, warping into something unnatural. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The car jerked to a halt, throwing me forward. The world went dark for a moment as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart still racing. I opened my eyes, confused, and looked around. The shadow had disappeared. The growl was gone. The road was still, the world eerily quiet. I had stopped at the edge of a forest. The trees were tall and dense, their branches twisting and reaching toward the sky like dark fingers. It was quiet here, too quiet. The road seemed to disappear into the woods, fading into nothingness. I had no memory of driving here. I couldn't recall taking any turns or exits. It was as if I had been led here, pulled by some unseen force. I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see the shadow behind me, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the woods still. But the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady. The forest loomed in front of me, dark and foreboding. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, a winding trail that beckoned me into its depths. Something was pulling me toward it. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't ignore the feeling. It was as though the forest was calling to me, like it knew something I didn't. It was as if it had been waiting for me. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't outrun the shadow. And I couldn't ignore the pull of the darkness any longer. I took a step into the woods, and the moment I did, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and the whispers returned, faint but growing louder. The growl was there again, distant but unmistakable. And in the distance, just beyond the trees, I could see it. The shadow. It was waiting for me. I felt the weight of the darkness around me as I stepped further into the forest. Each footfall seemed to echo, unnaturally loud in the stillness, and with every step, the air grew colder. The whispering was louder now, almost tangible, like invisible hands brushing across my skin, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't stop myself from moving forward. It wasn't fear driving me, it was something else. Something that felt inevitable. A force that had taken hold of me, pushing me deeper into the trees. I had no choice but to follow the pull, like a moth to a flame. And the growl, low and rumbling, was a constant reminder that something was waiting. Watching. The forest was dense. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching for me, clawing at the air as if they were alive, as if they were part of the shadow itself. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above, and what little light there was only seemed to deepen the darkness at my feet. And then, I saw it again. A flicker at the edge of my vision, a figure, just beyond the trees. It was tall, too tall, and its shape seemed to shift with every blink. The face, if you could even call it a face, was still the same, a blank, hollow void that seemed to absorb all light, all life. Its form was surrounded by a dark aura, a swirling mass of shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe. It was watching me. I stopped, my body frozen with fear. The growl grew louder, filling the silence of the woods like a heavy presence pressing down on me. I tried to move, to take another step, but my feet were stuck in place, as if the very earth had claimed them, as if the forest itself had wrapped its roots around my legs, holding me there. The figure moved then, slowly, deliberately, its long limbs stretching toward me, the shadows trailing in its wake. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't do anything but stare at it as it drew closer, its presence suffocating, like the darkness was swallowing everything around me. Why are you doing this? I whispered, my voice barely audible in the thick air. The figure's head tilted, as if considering my words. It didn't speak, but the growl in the air deepened, reverberating through the very trees themselves. And then, it moved closer, its hand, if you could even call it a hand, reaching toward me. No! No! I gasped, struggling to pull away, but the shadows had already wrapped around me, binding me to the spot. The figure's hand brushed against my face, and the world seemed to implode. My vision blurred, my senses overloaded with fear and darkness. The air became thick with something ancient and suffocating, like I was being pulled into a void. I gasped for breath, but the shadows pressed tighter, suffocating me from all sides. And then, the voice came. You should never have come here, it whispered, its voice dark and cold, like the wind howling through a desolate place. This place is ours. You are ours. I felt a chill run through my body, my heart racing in my chest. My thoughts began to unravel, and a terrifying realization hit me all at once. The shadow wasn't just a creature. It was something older, something far more powerful than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just following me, it was feeding off my fear. It thrived on it, grew stronger the more I panicked. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it win. With a strength I didn't know I had, I pushed against the darkness, trying to break free from its grip. I struggled, my arms aching as I clawed at the shadows that bound me. But the more I fought, the tighter the darkness squeezed, like a vice, threatening to crush me. But then, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath me shifted, and I felt myself falling. The shadows loosened, and for the first time, I could breathe. I hit the ground with a thud, my body slamming against the earth. I gasped for air, disoriented and shaken, but I couldn't stop moving. I had to get up. I had to run. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. I couldn't see clearly, but I knew the figure was still out there, somewhere in the trees, waiting. I had no idea where I was, no idea which direction to go, but I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let it catch me again. I ran. The woods stretched on, endless, the trees towering over me like dark sentinels. The air was thick, heavy, with every breath I took feeling more and more like I was choking. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. The growl was still there, faint but persistent, like it was just behind me, waiting for me to stumble. I ran for what felt like hours, my body exhausted, my mind racing with panic. My feet were sore, my chest tight, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in to the darkness. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A sliver of light ahead. The faintest glimmer of something other than darkness. I ran toward it, desperation pushing me forward. The shadows behind me seemed to grow stronger, faster, but I refused to look back. I couldn't afford to. I reached the light, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. It wasn't much, a small clearing in the forest, bathed in pale moonlight, but it was enough. The shadows seemed to recede, fading into the trees, unwilling to approach the light. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl was still there, distant, but it no longer felt so close. The light, though weak, had pushed the darkness back, for now. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened, trying to make sense of everything that had occurred. But there was no clear answer. Just the forest, the light, and the lingering presence of the shadow, still out there, waiting. I had escaped, for now. But I knew one thing for certain. The shadow wasn't done with me. It would never be done. I knelt in the small clearing, the moonlight weak but steady, casting long shadows on the ground. My chest heaved, every breath a struggle, but I knew one thing for certain. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to escape, the shadow would always be with me. It had followed me from the ballroom, through the streets, into the forest. Each step, each breath had been a reminder that the darkness was never far behind. Even in this small sliver of light, I could feel it. The growl was faint now, but it was there. The presence, like a cold wind, wrapped itself around me, seeping into my bones, reminding me that there was no safe place. I looked up into the trees, my mind reeling. The whispers that had taunted me before now felt like a distant hum, just beneath the surface of my consciousness. I could almost hear the shadow's voice again, a low, mocking tone that seemed to come from the depths of my mind. You cannot outrun what you are. The words echoed in my thoughts, cutting through the silence like a blade. The figure, the face, the void. It had told me that I belonged to it, that this place, this world, was its domain. And I was trapped in it, caught in its endless cycle of darkness and fear. I stood up, my legs shaky beneath me, my body trembling with exhaustion. There was nowhere left to go. The forest stretched endlessly, the trees closing in around me like a cage, a labyrinth with no exit. The light in the clearing was fading now, the moon shifting behind thick clouds, and I could feel the shadow creeping closer once more. For a long moment, I stood there, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the darkness to swallow me whole, to claim me once and for all. But it didn't. Instead, the world grew still. The air became thick, almost suffocating, as if everything had paused, as if the very universe were holding its breath. And then, in that eerie stillness, I realized something. The shadow wasn't just hunting me anymore. It wasn't just a force that followed, it was part of me. It had always been. From the moment I stepped into that ballroom, from the moment I first saw the figure, it had already claimed me. It was in my mind. In my soul. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just running from the shadow. I was running from myself. The growl rose again, louder this time, and the darkness surged around me. The trees began to shift, their twisted forms contorting into grotesque shapes, reaching out like arms that wanted to pull me back into the abyss. The light flickered, weak and trembling, as if it, too, was beginning to lose its fight against the shadows. I took a deep breath, my thoughts racing. I didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know how to fight it, how to escape it. But one thing was clear, I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep trying to outrun the inevitable. The shadow had me. And I had to face it. With trembling hands, I reached out toward the darkness, toward the figure that I knew was standing just beyond the trees, waiting. It was not just a shadow anymore. It was part of me. It was me. I stepped into the darkness. And in that moment, everything changed. And thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.